One thing I do want to point out, you may have noticed, and it's not just because of the camera work, in both this piece and in the quartet, how much Mozart relies on the first violin to carry a great deal of the material. This is something he inherited from Haydn, and you have to remember, again, that these are very new forms. It's not until we get to Beethoven that the string quartet really gets liberated so that the parts become more equal. And this is not an early work of Mozart's. This is K516, so it was written 1787, so this is 4 years before his death. Don't get me wrong, this is not a piece like an early string trio or quartet of Haydn in which it's almost all first violin and very, very accompanimental in the other instruments. But it's still not quite equivalent in the way you see in 19th century composers. The last piece that we're going to hear, the quintet for clarinet and strings, is one of the greatest works of chamber music ever written. And like the clarinet concerto, which was written right around the same time, they're both in the key of A major. Couple of things I would point out to you. It's in 4 movements with an allegro and then a larghetto, which is absolutely exquisite and magnificent in its simplicity. And then a minuet and trio, and then a theme and variations for the last movement. And I would just like to point out that in the final movement, that the mood darkens in the third variation with a viola solo, which comes out of nowhere. It doesn't sound like any of the other variations, but then he brings it back into major for the last 2 variations in the coda. It's just a wonderful, extremely Mozartian touch. We're going to hear it from a live performance with a group that I think was put together. And the only people I know in this group are Pamela Frank playing the first violin and a much younger Yo-Yo Ma playing cello. So we're going to hear the whole thing, and because this is my excuse, because the internet was so fractious when we started, we're going to run a couple minutes late, but you won't mind, I know, when you hear this. Notice how he's reversed in the development. He's reversed who has the opening melody and who has the answer. It's the clarinet that opened this time and the first violin answered. Now both the clarinet and the first violin are playing that melody together this time. And Mozart plays in that movement much more freely with the instruments. So there's canonic movement where first violin plays, and the second violin, then the viola, then the cello. So there's a lot. This is a big step forward in terms of the independence of the parts. And now he makes everything much simpler. No, they just are always adjusting their reeds, clarinetists. string players don't have to deal with condensation. As a former trombonist, I know the truth of this. This is the first variation.
looked at
I was right, right? It's a wonderful, wonderful piece.
Who was the clarinetist? Is that
The clarinetist was Seiji Yokokawa.
do you know where this took place?
I believe in Tokyo, but I'm not positive.
Okay.
Although the script looks Korean to me for the little bit that I know about it. They sure had a good time playing it too.
Especially younger mom.
He always enjoys it. Next week. Mozart, opera. Why did Mozart consider himself primarily an opera composer? That's a good question. There are many possible answers to that. One is that it gave him a chance to write many, many, many melodies within the course of the same work. He was very melodically driven. There are some composers who are more melodists than others. Mozart was a melodist. Despite the image we have of him just falling out of bed and endlessly making up melodies, as I think I may have said before, that is true, but then he worked on them. He worked very hard on his melodies to make them into the pristine things of beauty that we admire today. So that's one reason. Another reason was he was fascinated by humanity. And what is more the story of humanity artistically than opera? So he actually wrote his first works for the stage. We have to take that a little loosely, when he was 11, because the first work that he actually wrote was a sacred Singspiel, that is, a piece with spoken dialogue, and it was sacred, which would make it more like an oratorio, but it's still considered an opera. By the time he was 20, he had written well over a dozen. And he wrote, from the time he was 11 until his death, that's 24 years, he wrote 23 operas. There were some years where he didn't write any, but then there were years when he wrote a number. A lot of the earlier ones were produced in Salzburg, as could be understood. That was his home base. But by the time he was a teenager, they were being some of them were being produced in places like Milan, which was, of course, one of the places that he went on tour with his father when he was a teenager, and he learned a great deal about Italian operatic composition when he was there. He was like a sponge. He just absorbed all of this material. And then, when he did further tours, he also had some of his operas produced in Munich, and then finally in Vienna, where he settled in 1781 and 1782. Of his first 17 operas, only 4 of them were not produced during his lifetime, which is a really good record when you consider how difficult it was to spread the word on anything without a publisher. I mean, this was before the real age of publication, which kind of began with Beethoven, where it was easier, much easier to disseminate works of music. So that's a good record. And he worked with a number of different librettists. But one thing that is really important to remember about his writing for opera is that he had really firm ideas about the characters in the story and what he wanted from the librettist. So although we think of a couple of his most famous collaborators, namely Lorenzo da Ponte and also Emanuel Schikaneder, who wrote the libretto for The Magic Flute, Mozart was not above coaxing, cajoling, or bullying his librettists into getting what he wanted. So when we talk about psychological insight, and you can't talk about Mozart's great operas without talking about psychological insight, when we talk about that, we can give some of the credit to whoever wrote the original play or story on which the libretto was based, some of the credit to the librettist, but a lot of the credit to Mozart, not just in selecting the words and the portions of text that he wanted or that he wanted changed, but also in what he was able to show about the human condition through the music. And that's what's really, really important, because so much of it, you can close your eyes, you can get a tremendous amount out of a Mozart opera just by listening, even if you don't know the language. And he was wonderful at adapting himself to the language. Of course, he was a native German speaker, and yet his operas in Italian are the operas of an Italian. What I always say is when he was writing in Italian, he was an Italian composer. When he was writing in German, he was a German composer. And if you listen to the difference between Don Giovanni, for instance, and The Magic Flute, in terms of how the melodies are written, you can hear a really big difference in style. And it's not just because the story is different, it's because the language is different. And so he is adapting what he's doing to the language, also to the particular singers he was writing for. Okay? Today, we are covering a 2 3/4 hour opera in an hour and a quarter. The Le Nozze di Figaro was Mozart's 18th opera. It was produced first at the Burgtheater on the 5th of May in 1786. So by this time he was 30. He was married, had a couple of kids. He had been living in Vienna for about 4 years. It was quite successful. And then it went on to Prague, which was a much smaller musical setting than Vienna. But Prague went absolutely wild for The Marriage of Figaro. And Mozart was thrilled. He went there later that year, 1786, as they were producing it, and then it was produced in late December and into January, and he went to a gathering afterwards at which a number of the pieces were excerpted in instrumental form, and he wrote something to the effect of, they're just playing Figaro, they're singing Figaro, they're talking Figaro, there's nothing but Figaro. It's a great moment for me. And when we listen to the tunes in Figaro, there's no reason why that shouldn't be so. The music is just overflowing with great tunes that also at the same time are very fitting to the moment, to the dramatic or comedic moment. And you can tell when you listen to the overture and when you listen to this work where Rossini got a lot of his operatic inspiration. Was Rossini Italian? Sure he was. So he had a great tradition to draw on. But his nickname when he was a teenager was Il Tedeschino, the little German, because he was such an admirer of Mozart and Beethoven. And so he got a lot from this, and it shows up in The Barber of Seville, among other places, which was produced actually 30 years afterwards. Now, a little bit about the history of the text of the opera before we start to listen. This is the second of a set of 3 plays written by the French dramatist Beaumarchais about a set of characters. The first one is The Barber of Seville. The second is The Marriage of Figaro. And the third, nobody ever does, because it was very depressing, and it was something like the Troubled Wife or something like that. In the first one, Figaro is this kind of man about town who becomes the servant or helper to Count Almaviva as he's wooing Rosina and trying to lure her away from her guardian, who actually wants to marry her because she's got a lot of money, even though she's about a third his age. That all works out well. In the second play, Figaro has been rewarded by being made the head of the household of all the servants, and he is wishing to get married to the lady's maid, Susanna. The marriage of Almaviva and Rosina has hit some bumps because the Count has done what many noble counts do, in that he's had a roving eye and been able to satisfy that roving eye in a way that hurts his wife, and where she is really sorrowful about that. And the story carries on from there. The big change that was made from the play to the opera libretto was that the play actually had a really hard time being staged because it was so political. Now, you have to understand that the play was written in 1784. That's 5 years before the French Revolution, but during a time of great political ferment in France. Near the end of the play, Figaro has a big speech where he decries nobility and the privilege that comes with nobility. Well, of course, that didn't go over very well with the censors. So one of the first things that Lorenzo da Ponte did, and this was his first collaboration with Mozart, by the way, his second being Così fan tutte, and the third one being Don Giovanni. The first thing that he did was he got rid of all the political speech in it. So it became a domestic comedy rather than one with political implications. So that rant about privilege becomes a rant instead in Act 4 about unfaithful wives. So it becomes personal rather than political. The libretto centers on two couples. One very happy, about to get married, the other unhappy. Which reminds me of the opening of the novel Anna Karenina. Every happy family is happy in the same way. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The play basically is about the Count, who has abolished the medieval droit du seigneur, which was the right of the nobleman to take any young bride in his household to bed before her wedding night. He had abolished that when he married Rosina. So he had actually signed off on that, but he's trying to backpedal because he's very attracted to Susanna. She knows that, and she's at the beginning, you see, she's quite nervous about how close to the Count's bedroom their bedroom is going to be once they're married. So the whole play is basically about him wanting her and the other two trying to fool him and teach the Count a lesson. And there's all sorts of craziness that goes on with people hiding in closets and being discovered and jumping out of windows. And it also involves a young man named Cherubino, who has a very roving eye and keeps getting caught in compromising positions and infuriates the Count for a number of reasons. Well, he's jealous because he thinks that Cherubino is attached to his wife, but well, maybe. But in any case, that is a trouser role. It's usually sung by a mezzo-soprano or a soprano. And so his problem, that is Cherubino's problem, is that he can't decide on a particular woman. And he just, his head spins when he thinks about them all. And so This is an opera in 4 acts. I'm going to show you 4 different clips, okay? Some are longer than others. The first one, we're starting right at the beginning with the overture and going through the first scene with Figaro and Susanna planning making the final plans for their wedding. He's measuring out the room, and she's coming in with her new headgear to say, "Isn't this wonderful?" And then they're talking about different things and having a duet, and Figaro finds out about the Count's designs on Susanna, so he vows to stop him. By the way, another thing that this opera is about is men's bumbling attempts at sort of butting heads and establishing territory, and women's far more subtle ways of getting things done. Because the men's plans basically fall apart in a lot of ways, whereas the women's plans manage to move along okay. So anyway, that's the first 15 minutes, and this is a performance from Paris in 1993. It's a filmed performance, but I think what happens in it, when you see the overture, you'll notice that the orchestra's on the stage. Oh. And then it stops, and then it goes. You hear applause. So I think what happened was they filmed some things like the overture with them on the stage, and then they went to performance. So you can see sets changing, and you can hear applause and things like that, and it's clearly on a stage. And it stars the wonderful Bryn Terfel, the Welsh bass baritone, as Figaro, Alison Hagley as Susanna, Rodney Gilfrey as the Count, Hilevi Martin-Pelto, I don't know who she is, but she's a great Rosina. Pamela Helen Stephen plays Cherubino as the Monteverdi Choir, the English Baroque soloists. So you'll see in the overture historical instruments. So the flutes are without keys, they're with holes, and the clarinets are old and light wood, and the marvelous John Elliott Gardner conducting. So here's the overture and the first part of Marriage of Figaro. And by the way, you're going to be really angry with me at the end because I have to keep stopping it, okay? And I had to make choices. Sorry. Okay, starts right off. Notice how many women there are in the orchestra? It's pretty cool.